Welcome everyone. Welcome to today's live OECD Green Talk, which is on the topic of sustainable land use and aligning biodiversity, climate, and food objectives. How we manage land is critical in determining whether we're able to achieve many internationally agreed environmental objectives and social objectives, many of which are now also in the Sustainable Development Goals. The land use sector is responsible for approximately 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions, and land use change and management use is the key pressure on global biodiversity loss. Land for agriculture is needed to develop food and sustenance for our growing global population, and demand and competition for land is expected to increase over time. We are now in the so-called super year for climate and for biodiversity. The United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity will be hosting its 15th meeting of the Conference of Parties, which is taking place in October in 2020, where the new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is due to be agreed upon. And similarly, 2020 is the year when many countries are required to update their climate pledges, and where discussions under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change are to complete negotiations on the Paris Rulebook. The OECD has developed a large body of work to support governments in their efforts to mitigate climate change and to address the impacts of both climate change and of biodiversity. In this new publication today, we explore the biodiversity, climate, and food issues in an integrated way to examine how governments can move towards more coherent frameworks to address these issues in the context of land use. This particular report has been prepared by a cross-cutting group from analysts from both the climate team and the biodiversity team, namely Will Symes, Jane Ellis, who is sitting next to Will, and myself, together with contributions from two other colleagues who have now moved on, Yannick Topper and David Gowith. And today, Will Symes, a policy analyst with our biodiversity team and a key author of the report, will present some of the insights and the policy recommendations from this project that is being released today. I'd just like to highlight to hear the people in the room and also those that have connected via the link. Will Symes will talk for about 20 to 25 minutes on these topics, and afterwards there will be roughly half an hour for discussion, question and answers, etc. For those of you who are online today, you can send your questions at any time during the talk to questions moderator in the chat section of your WebEx screen, and I will convey them to Will afterwards during the question and answer session. This is your chance to dig deeper into the subject. So without further ado, Will, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Katia, and good afternoon, everybody, and good morning and good evening, depending on where you're tuning in to this webinar today. It's very good to have you here and listening to me talk about the report that was authored by myself, Jane and Katia, and that was released today on Towards Sustainable Land Use, Aligning Policies for Biodiversity, Climate and Food. So the first question we should answer really is, why look at land use? Well, quite simply because 2/3 of the world's ice-free surface is now impacted by humans. And the current global land use system is unsustainable. This means that there are significant impacts for biodiversity, with land use change estimated as the largest driver of biodiversity loss by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES as it's better known. And 25% of all plant and animal species are now facing extinction in the coming decades. Land use also has significant impacts for climate change, with around 23% of global greenhouse gas emissions originating from agriculture, forestry and other land use, according to the IPCC. But also, and as importantly, unsustainable land use has significant impacts on society, with negative well-being impacts on 3.2 billion people globally from land degradation, and estimated costs of $10.6 trillion a year to the economy of the planet. As Katia has already mentioned, land use is absolutely central to achieving many international environmental commitments. And these include the Paris Agreement, the Aichi targets under the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, and of course the Sustainable Development Goals. It's also important to iterate that land use is likely to become more important going forward as global populations rise and develop, and people shift towards more carbon-intensive diets. Pressures on global land use systems are likely to increase in the future. When we consider climate change, land use becomes especially important given the reliance of the reliance of scenarios for limiting warming below 1.5 and 2 degrees on bioenergy, specifically an estimated increase of 600 million hectares up to of bioenergy crops globally, which is again likely to put further pressure on land use systems. Land use change is also the primary driver of biodiversity loss, as already mentioned, and so transitioning towards sustainable land use systems is essential for meeting the Aichi targets, but also it's likely to remain essential for any post-2020 biodiversity framework to be negotiated this year at CBD COP15. And of course, sustainable development, being a cross-cutting issue, is reliant on sustainable land use systems, specifically the SDGs goal 15, which is on life on land, but also 2, 6, 7 and 13. And for those of you who can't immediately recall all the SDGs, that's the goals on zero hunger, clean water, clean energy and climate action. But beyond those direct impacts, there are lots of indirect impacts on the SDGs for poverty, health, economic growth and even the oceans. There are many more MEAs that I've not had a chance to mention, but they're of course things like the UNCCD, the Convention on Combating Desertification, CMS, the Bonn Challenge, New York Declaration on Forests, both on forestry, and the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands are also absolutely reliant on sustainable land use. But addressing these issues is a complex challenge with multiple interactions and synergies and trade-offs that needs to be managed. Action on one area can impact another area both positively and negatively. This is a very simplified diagram of some of those interactions on just 4 SDGs. So of course the actual reality is much more complicated, and understanding how countries can manage and address these trade-offs and synergies is the central question of this piece of work. Excuse me. So what do we cover in the report? Well, we look at 6 case study countries, and these are Brazil, France, Ireland, Indonesia, Mexico, New Zealand, and I will come back to why we chose those countries in a minute. But the report covers 3 key entry points in the policy making process. And these are national strategies and action plans, which really set the overarching framework and goals for national land use systems. Institutional coordination and coherence, because it is the institutions themselves that are responsible for implementing and devising the policies in land use systems, and of course policy instruments, because these are the things that ultimately provide the environment for actors within land use systems on the ground. And so we chose these 6 case study countries because they all have relatively large and emissions from agriculture and land use sectors. This graph shows the the emissions from land use change and forestry and agriculture in 2014. That was 2014 because that's the latest available data for certain countries. But you can see that most of these, or all of these countries in fact, have much larger percentage of emissions from agriculture than the OECD average, which is the column on the right hand side of the graph. And emissions from other land use is, while highly variable, important to understanding the systems of land use in these countries. Secondly, and relatedly, these countries have very important agriculture and or forestry sectors which provide significant contributions to national GDP. This makes transitioning to sustainable land use in these 6 countries an absolute environmental and economic imperative, and therefore we thought they were interesting because they're really on the front line of addressing these kind of alignment issues that we are going to talk about. Finally, it should also be mentioned that for all of these countries, international trade in agriculture and or forestry products is very important to their kind of economic well-being. For example, 57.1% of exports from New Zealand were from agricultural products. And the kind of synergies we're talking about in this report are well illustrated by the problem of food loss and waste. So the environmental impacts of food loss and waste are quite staggering. Approximately 30% of agricultural output is lost or wasted each year. And this equates to these very large looking figures on the slide here. And to put them into some kind of context, if food loss or waste was a country, it would be the third largest emitter globally, behind only the USA and China. And 1.4 billion hectares, for those of you who are struggling to imagine how large that is in reality, is approximately the size of Antarctica, or 1.6 times the size of Brazil. So it's an enormous area we're talking about that's affected by this problem. So reducing food loss and waste represents a clear opportunity to reduce emissions, have positive impacts on biodiversity, and really reduce pressure on land use systems. So despite seeming to be only tangentially related to land use, it's this kind of action that can help us provide multiple benefits to society from transitioning to sustainable land use. So first, I want to talk about what we found regarding national strategies and action plans in the report. So for this report, we considered national strategies and action plans that were created in response to multilateral environmental agreements, such as nationally determined contributions in response to the Paris Agreement, national biodiversity strategy and action plans in response to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, but we also considered sector-level plans that were relevant to land use, such as agriculture, forestry, and development. And I just want to highlight some of the key findings, because the report obviously has way more than I can cover in 20 minutes. So if you'll bear with me as I give you a quick whistle-stop tour of what we found. Firstly, we found that the degree to which land use is considered in strategies and action plans is highly variable. Excuse me. For example, forestry, agriculture and climate change were often considered in the national biodiversity strategy and action plans, and in many cases associated with targets, but fewer countries had targets associated with ecosystems, agriculture and forestry in their climate plans. And this probably relates in some extent to the differing level of guidance provided by the relative MEAs on what to include in these kind of strategy and action plans. But also, we found that trade-offs between different policy goals were rarely acknowledged. And this is despite specific guidance from both the CBD and the SDGs to do so. SDG 17.14, for example, is to ensure coherent policy making for sustainable development. And without acknowledging that these trade-offs exist, this is the first stage to really understanding how to manage these better in a national context. Next, we found that few strategies and action plans contained specific targets with quantifiable goals, and even fewer had indicators related to these goals. Now, this is very important because without having a specific target, it's hard to understand what the end point of a policy is, and therefore the interventions required to get there. There were some good examples of plans that contained specific targets and indicators, and I will come on to those a bit more in a minute, but generally they the biodiversity strategy and action plans were more likely to contain specific goals than plans in other areas. And also plans for trade were likely to contain specific goals for growth in the export of certain products. We then go on to make some recommendations on how countries can address these issues. First, it's important to ensure that a broad range of all the stakeholders relevant to policy making and land use are engaged in the creation of strategies and action plans. This way you can ensure there's a holistic view of the issues you're facing and that important aspects of those problems are not inadvertently missed out. A good practice example of this was the creation of the Irish National Planning Framework, which included both a cross-ministerial steering committee of the various different government actors, but also a national consultation process to bring in the non-state actors who would ultimately be affected by this plan and ensure that views were considered and represented adequately. The second recommendation I would like to highlight from the report is that including specific, measurable, actionable, realistic and time-bound, so-called SMART targets associated with quantifiable indicators is absolutely crucial for facilitating aligned policy making in the climate, biodiversity, food and land use nexus. Now, going back to the good practice examples I mentioned before, Targets 7 and 8 of the Brazilian National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan have specific targets for the reduction in nutrient loss from farming areas into non-agricultural adjacent areas and specific indicators associated with this, which in theory should mean that that target is easier to achieve, or not easier but more realistic. Secondly, I would like to talk about institutional coordination and coherence and what we found in the report. Now, it's the institutions themselves that actually create and implement the policies in the land use nexus. And so having joined up institutional processes is key for policy alignment. What we found was that land use governance is often fragmented between different national level sectoral ministries and different national and subnational governments. Both vertical and horizontal coordination is challenging in these conditions. This is particularly important in large decentralized countries such as Indonesia and Brazil. For example, in Indonesia, there are at least 8 different national ministries, 6 non-departmental bodies, the Office of the President, and provincial and municipal level governments, all involved in the creation and implementation of land use policy. And this split is understandable given the reliance of subnational governments on land use for generating tax revenues. And often it's desirable in so much as it can facilitate the creation of context-specific solutions for local, environmental, social and economic factors. But it can create challenges for the coordination and implementation of policies, given the potential for overlapping institutional mandates and the variation in priorities and capacities between different ministries and levels of government. Secondly, we found that there'd been a significant impact of multilateral environmental agreements on national institutional contexts. For example, many countries had created specific institutions in response to MEAs, such as for cross-cutting issues such as sustainable development, but also for specific things like reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, so-called RED. Institutional arrangements have been created in both Brazil and Indonesia, specifically in response to this UN initiative. And this is important because it shows the impact of international agreements on national level governance and how these things can be really important for how land use systems operate on the ground. So as the report, we recommend that strengthening institutional coordination both horizontally across national level ministries and vertically between national and subnational. And I would like to discuss 3 mechanisms that we've identified in the report for doing this. If you'll excuse me. Firstly, the creation of specific bodies to facilitate the coordination of policy creation has been successful. And these are often created, as just mentioned, in response to MEAs, or such as the SDGs, and very often they're facilitated by leadership from the very top of the political spectrum, so that be the office of the President or the Prime Minister. A good practice example of this is Mexico, which has created a National Council for the 2030 Agenda, which is responsible for coordinating actions in response to the SDGs, and making sure that the national level ministries that are responsible for particular goals have followed through with the commitments that they've made. Secondly, and related but somewhat different, dedicated mechanisms for institutional coordination, both horizontally and vertically, are important for ensuring aligned policy making. This differs from the previous point because here we're really talking about having coordination baked into the institutional systems that are already there. So rather than creating new institutions in response to goals, this is having a kind of an intrinsic method of coordinating creation. A good practice example of this is from Indonesia, which, as already mentioned, faces considerable challenges for policy coordination due to its complicated institutional environment. And in Indonesia, they have both coordinating ministries, which are responsible for harmonizing policy action across national level line ministries, but also there's a specific Ministry of Development Planning known as Bappenas, which is responsible for coordinating different ministerial inputs into national development plans to make sure that everybody's interests are adequately represented. And finally, vertical coordination can be facilitated by the subnational representation of national level bodies. And this is particularly important given the local nature of governance, of land use governance, as already discussed. By having a subnational representation of national level bodies, you can really help ensure that the norms and regulations created at a national level are adequately represented subnationally and smooth over what might be potentially differing institutional priorities and capabilities at subnational level. Next, I would like to talk about the policy instruments for achieving sustainable land use systems. Now, there are an extremely broad and large variety of policy instruments available, and so rather than go on for the next 2.5 hours about everything that's there, I'm going to talk about some more general lessons that we have learned from our work. Firstly, clear and secure land tenure are essential prerequisites for effective and aligned policy making for land use. If the land tenure is not clear, then it hampers enforcement because it becomes difficult to identify which stakeholder is allowed to carry out what action in a particular area of land. And this can create a grey area that can lead to unsustainable practices and potentially undermine the sustainability of land use systems. Secondly, secure land tenure. Without secure land tenure, it incentivizes activities that maximize returns in the short term. And so in many cases, this results in land clearing because it allows, particularly in forest areas where there's significant value in standing forest that can be extracted quickly. It also often incentivizes activities that can increase the strength of the tenure that a stakeholder has, which again tends to result in land clearing. Next, we found that the negative externalities of land use tend to be under or unpriced. This is important because it means that the reduction in the provision of public goods from unsustainable land use is generally not captured in the market or often in regulatory frameworks. A good example of this is that despite the public health implications of some pesticide use, as well as other impacts, only France and Mexico apply a risk-based taxing approach from our case study countries for these chemicals, where the tax rate increases with the potential environmental risk. Excuse me. Finally, it's important to note that there's a broad range of policy instruments available, and what the most effective policy mix in a given landscape will be is entirely or highly dependent on the socio-economic conditions in a given area. And so countries need a broad toolkit of policy instruments to make sure, or to be able to ensure, that land use is sustainable across a range of different tenure, economic and environmental conditions. Next, we found that ecosystems provide a range of services to society, but government support to food production tends to be significant, with large agriculture producer support in all the case study countries bar New Zealand. Now, there are many good reasons for governments to support agriculture, not least of which because food is fundamental to human well-being. But much of this support also contains distortionary market price support, which can maintain and potentially environmentally harmful support, such as concessionary credit for commercial farmers in Brazil or subsidized electricity for pumping water in Mexico, which can maintain unsustainable practices and, in some cases, encourage the expansion of agriculture into non-agricultural lands, such as forested areas. While SDG 12.3 encourages countries to halve per capita food waste, data and information on food loss and waste is lacking at policy relevant scales, making tracking progress difficult and identifying effective policy instruments also challenging. Some countries have well developed policies for reducing food loss and waste, France being a very good example, which offers tax breaks to farmers to redistribute food that would be lost, and requires supermarkets to sign agreements to distribute food that's still edible yet cannot be sold. However, even in France, the tracking of the impact of these policies and the tracking of food waste is challenging, and so it's difficult to understand where and how these things have been effective, meaning that progress on this issue is still unclear. Finally, I would like to highlight that despite the impacts of international trade on land use, and international trade is absolutely fundamental to food security, despite the large role that it plays in these systems, the impacts are not well, both positive and negative, are not well quantified at policy relevant scales, making it difficult to understand how these impacts can be effectively managed by countries. And so the report recommends several things, and I'm going to highlight three of them here. Firstly, the old adage of what gets measured gets managed is as true today as it ever was, and so better data, particularly spatial data, are needed to inform policy making for sustainable land use. Big and open data approaches are becoming increasingly important to land use, and in fact many countries have embraced them, with Mexico having a notable commitment to open government data and spatial data platforms available in Indonesia, Mexico and New Zealand. But a better integration of this data through comprehensive spatial planning processes, for example, is absolutely key for aligned policy making for sustainable land use. Further, this also extends to international trade and the application and development of techniques that really understand the impacts of the production of products across their whole lifespan is key for understanding how to measure and manage the impacts of international trade on land use. Next, countries can reassess the balance of support between relevant ecosystem services from land, particularly carbon and biodiversity benefit. A good first step really is to assess the impact of support systems on land use and reform support that may be harmful. And some countries have already begun this process. For example, France has recently assessed the biodiversity impact of its subsidy regimes, and Indonesia has recently completed a peer review process under part of the G20 on their fossil fuel subsidies. These efforts should be applauded, supported and intensified if we are to transition effectively to sustainable land use in the long term. And finally, regulations for land use need to be consistently monitored and enforced. If environmental governance is weakened for whatever reason, perhaps due to shifting political priorities, previous gains can be reversed with serious environmental consequences. Thank you everybody for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Well, thank you very much. I do have a number of questions here from participants not in the room, but just to get a sense of numbers, if you have questions here within the room as well, please raise your hand. But for now, I'll start with a first question, which is from Carolyn Surzak-Lamy, who's LinkedIn via the computer system. And the question is, how do you recommend to price negative externalities of land use that are currently underpriced, as you had highlighted in the presentation?
Thank you, Carolyn, for your very important and complicated question, and I will try and give an answer. I think there's no silver bullet for pricing negative externalities of land use. I mean, there are a number of different impacts, and I think there is a wide range of methods for trying to understand what they are, and some of them are more challenging to price than others, and also some of them are more challenging to implement than others. For example, the impacts of land use on biodiversity are incredibly difficult to price and incredibly difficult to actually implement policies to address, and that's one of the things that I think there's significant work on at the moment, and that's an ongoing process. But I will give you an example of. We'll just give you an example of nutrients and excess nitrogen and phosphorus on land. So there are several countries that have implemented policies to price excess fertilizer use, namely Denmark is a good example. And there are significant technical challenges to doing so, because you have to first understand what is the optimal use of nutrients. And second, you have to understand how nutrients are leached from a given area of land under what conditions, and that involves kind of complicated assessment of biogeochemical processes. And so you have to first create nutrient transit models, and then define the level of nutrient you're willing to accept, the level of fertilizers, nitrogen you're willing to accept, and then beyond that you can then implement a tax on fertilizers that are used beyond that benchmark level that you've set. But actually, even then it's challenging, because you need to be able to track application and purchasing of various stakeholders. But despite the technical challenges, it has been implemented effectively in Denmark, and I believe the results of the New Zealand, I'm going to get this wrong, tax working group suggested that this might be a method for addressing the water quality issues that they've been having in New Zealand in recent years. So I'm not sure whether I answered your question, Carolyn, but that is the answer I'm going to give.
Okay. Another question from Stefan Porter is based on the case study countries. What are some of the most critical policy incoherencies?
So that is a good question. I think it's much easier to identify historic incoherent policy than it is to identify current incoherency, because it's difficult to understand what the impacts of current policies are. So I'm going to answer your question by giving you a couple of examples of where policies haven't achieved what they were supposed to historically, if that's okay. So the first one I would like to highlight is a policy of afforestation in Ireland. That there is still an afforestation policy going on, and I'm not talking about what they're currently doing, which is very good and well aligned, given its reliance on, given its strong inclusion of natural forestry. But historically, there was a push to forest peatlands on some peatland areas, and this, while in theory it leads to carbon sequestration from the trees, in fact you have to drain the peatland, which leads to soil oxidation, which then leads to large levels of emissions from the peat itself. So you actually often end up increasing emissions by planting forestry on peatlands. And secondly, you replace these rare kind of high diversity grassland or peat habitats, which they are not high in absolute diversity, but what biodiversity is there is unique. And by replacing that with, say, plantation forestry, you end up with actually lower biodiversity and increased emissions. And so this was something that occurred in some regions of Ireland in the 90s. I think another policy incoherence is probably there was an issue with biofuel, whereby significant targets for biofuel blending were leading to land use change, potentially an increased demand for palm oil. And so then you end up with, it's a well-documented problem with the EU biofuel policy, which ended up with potentially leading to increased emissions. And it's those kind of things that it's really difficult to manage effectively and predict in advance.
Okay. Another question is, reforming policies can be challenging, particularly for areas with strong lobbies. How can governments overcome these challenges?
Oof, another simple question. So this is a very good point. So the political economy of reforming policies for land use is very challenging, because land use systems tend to have grown up over a long time, and they're quite there's all sorts of communities and very much social systems that are attached to land use systems as well as environmental systems. And so it's really important that first you consider the political economy of what you're trying to do, and who would benefit from the change and who would lose out. So you don't want to accidentally create, a government doesn't want to accidentally create distributional impacts from reforming land use systems. A good way of addressing this is a kind of broad and comprehensive stakeholder engagement. I think a good practice example of this would be the Grenelle process in France, which is a long process of creating and reforming environmental policies based on an enormous engagement of stakeholders. So it's really important to kind of understand the distributional impacts and understand your constituency of stakeholders. But the OECD has actually worked on this before. And there's a report on the political economy of biodiversity reform, which I can invite if maybe Katia would like to talk to that, or.
I think we'll focus on this for the moment,
Okay.
actually, because we do have a number of questions, so
Okay.
I'd rather focus on that. Another question is from Hongxia Du. How can financial policies or instruments be applied to foster sustainable land use?
Again, thank you, Hongxia, for the very interesting question. I think I raised it at the end of my talk, but a really important aspect of financial policies for sustainable land use is to reform and assess harmful subsidies, or potentially environmentally harmful subsidies, I should say. Really understanding what the impacts of government support are to various different land uses is absolutely essential, given the large amount of support that goes to some of these areas. I think there's some interesting other policy instruments that can be explored, like payments for ecosystem services. So, as I mentioned, there's a number of beneficial ecosystem services that come from land use, and there's often they're not, the people that use them are not, their value is not really captured, and so payments for ecosystem services programs essentially link the users of these things like water with the providers. And there's some very good examples of these. The classic one being New York with the Catskill Mountains, where the New York City decided to invest in sustainable land use in an upstream water catchment in order to reduce the costs of downstream water treatment and ensure the provision of clean water to New York. So I think payments for ecosystem services are one good approach, and also, I'm going to leave it there.
Okay. Another question, which was focusing on the national strategies and action plans. What is missing? Is it capacity, tools, incentives, or those are just examples, for governments to include more specific and measurable targets and also indicators in their strategies so as to measure progress?
That's another very good question. There's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation when it comes to specific targets and indicators. So I think, as I discussed at the end of the talk, actually there's been an explosion in the availability of data, particularly spatial data and remote sensing data, from a lot of it's from satellite, but also from other areas. But I think that the uptake of this data in the policy making process has been maybe it could have been faster. I think increasing the use of this kind of data makes it easier to create specific targets, because you can understand what you're able to measure, essentially. So I guess in that respect, it may be a capacity issue, but I think also this isn't just a capacity issue for governments, this is a capacity issue for everybody, for scientists, for researchers, for policymakers. That actually the amount of data we have and our ability to analyse it effectively is still catching up with the amount of data that's available. So I think increasing the kind of investments in research and analysis and use of this kind of data would really facilitate the creation of specific targets.
If I can also
Yes,
just jump
yeah,
in
go for
there. I think it's also very helpful when you have multilateral environmental agreements that are also calling for those more specific and measurable targets. So for example, right now under the Convention on Biological Diversity, one of the major calls is that the post-2020 framework does indeed have more specific, measurable targets from the period 2020 onwards, in contrast to the Aichi targets, which were already a great achievement, but we can do better. And so if you have international agreement, then when the governments are developing their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, they're guided by those targets, which then they need to put in place at their, if they decide to put those into their own national strategies and action plans. So it helps to have top-level guidance, which can then also help guide across countries, because then you have comparable targets that you can see then, how has one country put this in place, put the target in place versus another. And then it also helps in with regard to indicators, especially, for example, in the context of biodiversity, where there are so many different types of indicators that you can use, to have some kind of international level agreement or guidance at least, that can then help to inform and recommend to countries at the national level which indicators they can use. If you compare this to climate change, where you have the one unit of metric, which is ton of CO2 equivalent, it's a given. It's like a gift nearly that exists. And so you can use the same metric for climate change across countries in the context of mitigation. But this is, so I've just highlighted the difference between climate and biodiversity, but it would be wonderful also in the context of agriculture or other types of national level policies if there were some international level guidance in a sense for those. You have them for climate and biodiversity, and it's already a very good start. It helps to encourage governments to do the same at the national level. Sorry, I just took off my moderator hat and now I'm going to put it back on. A question from Carlos Texera. In cases where clear land tenure of land is not available, for example, where the registry is outdated, what are some of the best approaches to proceed in this sort of second best?
Thank you, thank you for the question, Carlos. I think that what the best approach to proceed is entirely dependent on the context which you're talking about, and I think there's an enormous variety of land tenure contexts globally, and so I can't necessarily sit here and recommend what the best thing to do is. I think what's really important, actually, particularly in tropical areas, is the recognition and representation of customary and indigenous tenure, particularly in sort of forest and forest frontier areas. I know that there's a big commitment from Indonesia specifically to increase the level of community forestry in terms of the amount of land that's now managed by kind of communities and village and sort of indigenous groups. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what that target is, but that's a process that Indonesia is currently going through at the moment. I think, again, to actually completely understand what the best way to proceed is entirely dependent on the context, and yeah, I'm not sure I can give a particularly specific answer to that question.
If you want to go ahead, if you want to, feel free. Okay, another question then from outside is from Madoko Yoshino, who asks, what kind of targets and indicators would be helpful in ensuring sustainable land use in a post-2020 global biodiversity framework? So what kinds of targets and indicators would be helpful in ensuring sustainable land use?
That's a very good question. I think for the post-2020 framework, we have to carefully look at what we already have in terms of targets and indicators and see how we can build on that to make a kind of more effective and more specific inputs into biodiversity. I think in terms of land use, we have to look at what's worked effectively in the Aichi targets, and the target for protected areas has worked pretty effectively. But also, I think it's important to look beyond that. And of course, addressing land use change is super important. The part of the problem with that is that land use is very difficult to measure, particularly via remote sensing. And so having a specific target and a measurable target on land use, well, having an indicator on land use change is challenging. Having a target is still challenging, but I think possible. I think it's important to maybe look at the extent of ecosystems somehow, be that forest ecosystems or grasslands, or maybe incorporating that into the post-2020 framework somehow. Of course, there's only so much I can say on this topic, but I think the actual targets for the post-2020 unfortunately was not something we were able to cover in our report, but I'm not sure if Katia would like to input onto that at all.
Well, some of the things that it would be helpful. So, for example, in the current Aichi Biodiversity Framework, there are targets on the need for sustainable forestry, the need for sustainable agriculture, the need to scale up positive incentives and potentially reform subsidies and incentives that are harmful to biodiversity. So in a post-2020 framework, if we're building off of that, the more granular the targets can become, and the more specific in the sense that you can identify, you have a specific target, and you can look for an indicator that already exists so that you're able to monitor progress towards that. Whether it's on, do we have data, for example, on sustainable forestry through forest certification schemes? And that is actually one of the indicators that are currently being used in the framework, but can we ensure that all countries have that sort of data, so then you can have a more global perspective on how countries are doing on sustainable forestry? And the same holds true for a number of other targets. Today, if you look at protected areas, which Will mentioned, it's one of the few targets, in a sense, that we have consistent and comparable data for across all the countries. And so in the context of land use more generally, if you think of the different types of land uses, can we identify indicators that can help monitor progress, whether it's sustainable forestry, sustainable agriculture, and then the indicators that you can monitor progress, and then make sure that the actual target itself isn't ambiguous, so that it's not subject to interpretation in like many different ways by different countries. So the clearer the target is, the more it can encourage action, and clear action, you have a clear direction of where it is that we want to go, and hence hopefully also a better understanding afterwards with the indicators of, are we achieving those goals, are we off track, and not just at the global level for all countries, but at a global level, but also if you can disaggregate it at the national level. So if you have those indicators that are being used in a consistent and comparable way across countries for the different elements of sustainable land use, and there are many, then the more measurable a post-2020 global biodiversity framework can be. Another question is action on climate, biodiversity, and food. Sounds great in theory, but would it lead to food security issues in some areas? And how do you address these possible trade-offs? In your policy responses.
That is a very good question. I think There has been work done looking at the food security implications of mitigation from agriculture and addressing food loss and waste. And I think it's important to recognise that there may well be these implications, but it's key to understand what they are in order to put in place policies to address them. I think with food loss and waste, it's probably not possible or desirable to reduce it to zero. The actual costs, the marginal costs associated with reducing it will increase, and then I think the research that I've read shows that if you try and reduce to zero, it becomes prohibitively expensive, and could lead to price increases. So I think it's important to understand where the point at which it's no longer economically sensible or environmentally sensible to address these things is important. But this is not. I don't think this is a potential food security implications is a reason that we need to understand the impacts better, and it's not a reason to not address these issues, because they are absolutely essential to ensuring that land use systems become sustainable in the long term.
Thanks. Yes. So just to add, obviously there can be trade-offs. So, for example, if you increase the intensity of agricultural production, you'll get more food, but it might be at the expense of biodiversity, or even increased greenhouse gas emissions from fertilizers. So, as Will was saying, and as we were saying earlier, that's one of the key messages of this report, is that it's really important to improve the information base, because at the moment, the trade-offs, the biophysical trade-offs, they're real, but they can vary from site to site. And so governments really need to get a good handle on what the impacts are before they can assess how to address them in the most effective way.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks.
Sorry, microphone. Another question from Morgana Chioccia. In the context of land use, there's SDG target 15.3.1 on land degradation neutrality. Was this included in your analysis as well in the report?
We didn't specifically look at how to achieve land degradation neutrality per se, but the report is itself about reducing land degradation, and looking at how you create policies to essentially ensure that land use is sustainable, and then, I guess by definition that would include some overlap with how you achieve land use degradation neutrality. But the specific target itself was not a primary focus of the report.
Okay. Lovely. Well, that brings us to the end of, it's been an hour, and so I'd like to thank everyone for the questions that were raised, and also, of course, Will Symes for the presentation today, and the audience here in the room. We have here on the website also the short link where the full report is available. And so again, thanks very much. And we look forward to the next Green Talk Live here at the OECD. Thank you.